The allegation that shook the halls of power. It started like any other quiet morning in London. The rain was soft, the air heavy, and the streets outside Buckingham Palace carried their usual calm rhythm. But inside the world of politics, something was about to explode. A man named Edward Marshall, a former royal guard, stepped forward with a story that would soon shake both the British royal establishment and American politics. He was not a man who liked attention. For 20 years, Edward had served the crown with loyalty and silence. He had protected kings, queens, and visiting dignitaries. His record was spotless, until now. On a cold Monday morning, Edward walked into the London High Court surrounded by lawyers and reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones pointed at him from every direction, and then came the breaking news. Former Royal Guard files a $100 million lawsuit against U.S. Senator J.D. Vance. The headline spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was all over television and social media. News anchors spoke in disbelief. Why would a royal guard, known for discipline and secrecy, sue a sitting American senator for such a massive amount? What could he possibly know? As the details came out, the story became even more unbelievable. Edward claimed that while serving on a special security assignment years ago, he had been witness to illegal political deals involving Senator J.D. Vance and powerful international figures. According to him, there were documents, recordings, and conversations that could expose a deep web of influence, one that reached from the halls of Westminster all the way to Washington. D.C. people who knew Edward were stunned. They described him as quiet but sharp, strict but fair. He was the kind of man who stood tall even in the rain, never speaking out of turn, never breaking protocol. That was why his decision to go public felt so shocking. At first, many thought it was a misunderstanding, perhaps a mix-up, maybe even blackmail. But when the legal papers were officially filed, everything changed. Inside those documents were dates, times, and specific events that matched real government schedules. It wasn't a random story anymore. It was a serious allegation backed by detail. J.D. Vance, a rising political star known for his strong speeches and loyal followers, suddenly found himself at the center of a storm. His office called the lawsuit ridiculous and politically motivated. But behind the scenes, insiders said the senator looked worried. Meetings were cancelled, advisors were replaced, and his team began preparing for a full-blown public defense. Back in London, Edward's lawyers held a press conference. They claimed their client had been threatened multiple times before coming forward. He stayed silent for years out of loyalty, one attorney said. But when loyalty is betrayed, silence becomes guilt. Those words struck deep. Every newspaper headline carried a new angle. Some called Edward a hero, others called him a traitor. But everyone agreed on one thing: his story could destroy careers. Overnight, reporters dug into Edward's past. They found records showing he had indeed worked security during high-profile diplomatic visits, including one where J.D. Vance was part of an American delegation attending a private Vatican event. During that same visit, according to Edward, strange meetings had taken place behind closed doors. He claimed to have seen Vance meet with individuals connected to private security firms, European donors, and even political strategists. He never spoke of it before, not until he realized those same people had used his name and service record in fraudulent financial transactions without his consent. That's when he decided to take legal action. By the end of the week, the story had become an international spectacle. The White House refused to comment. British officials remained silent. Social media users picked sides. Justice for Edward trended for days. Others mocked him as a bitter ex-guard chasing attention. But Edward didn't appear desperate or angry. In every interview, he spoke calmly, almost coldly. "I protected the truth for years," he said once, "but truth doesn't need a shield. It needs a voice." His words echoed everywhere. People began to see him not just as a man with a grudge, but as a whistleblower standing up against a political system too powerful to question. Yet those who had worked with him in the Royal Guard worried for his safety. He had broken a sacred rule: never expose what happens behind royal or diplomatic walls. In the days that followed, more information began leaking online. Anonymous posts claimed to have seen parts of the evidence, encrypted emails, financial records, even surveillance clips. Whether real or fake, they fueled public curiosity and suspicion. J.D. Vance, meanwhile, faced growing pressure. Opposition leaders demanded he step down until the matter was cleared. His supporters argued it was all a smear campaign before an upcoming election. But inside his own party, tension was rising. If what the Guard says is true, one insider reportedly told a journalist, this could end everything. As for Edward Marshall, he stayed out of the spotlight for a few days. He was seen only once, leaving his lawyer's office, head held high, walking through a swarm of flashing cameras. He didn't say a word, but his silence spoke volumes. The world was now waiting for the proof, waiting for the trial, waiting to see if one man's courage could truly bring down a political empire. And in that waiting, a question hung heavy over every conversation. What did the Royal Guard know, and why had he chosen to speak now? The Guard's secret assignment. Before the world knew his name, Edward Marshall was just another face in the Royal Guard line, steady, silent, and unshakable. Every morning, he polished his boots until they shone, pressed his uniform to perfection, and took his post without a word. Years of training had taught him that his job wasn't to speak, but to observe. And that skill, the ability to notice what others ignored, would one day change everything. It was the spring of 2018 when Edward received a sealed letter at his residence in Windsor. The royal seal on the envelope told him it wasn't ordinary duty. Inside, a short message read, Special Protection Detail, Vatican visit, duration 3 days, discretion required. He had served dozens of foreign visits before, but something about this one felt different. The order came directly from the Office of Diplomatic Security, not the palace itself. His assignment was to join a small, hand-picked team to assist with a private delegation from the United States, led by a young senator named J.D. Vance. Edward knew little about American politics, but he had read the name before. A best-selling author turned lawmaker, known for his charm and ambition. He was said to be close to several European financiers who supported his political campaigns. At first, that didn't concern Edward. His duty was simple: protect the guests, maintain silence, and report only to his commanding officer. When he arrived in Rome, the Vatican was unusually tense. Security was tighter than usual, and the guest list for the event was strictly confidential. Edward and his fellow guards were stationed near the Apostolic Palace, where a small gathering was scheduled to take place. On the first night, everything seemed normal. Delegates exchanged polite smiles, priests blessed the crowd, and cameras captured the formal moments. But Edward noticed something odd. Senator Vance was meeting privately with a man in a gray suit who was not listed on any official document. They shook hands quickly, exchanged envelopes, and disappeared into a restricted chamber. Edward's instincts told him it wasn't part of the planned agenda. His training urged him to ignore it. But when he checked the guest registry later, he found the man's name written in pencil, a clear breach of protocol. He quietly took note of the time, the faces, and the symbols on the envelope. Over the next 2 days, more strange events unfolded. Vance's team made late-night phone calls, bypassed Vatican security, and held closed-door meetings with a private security firm known to operate in conflict zones. One of the company's vehicles even entered the restricted courtyard without clearance, something Edward had never seen happen before. By the final day, Edward's curiosity had turned to concern. During a mass inside St. Peter's Basilica, he was assigned to stand near the western gate, guarding the procession exit. From that post, he saw Vance again, this time whispering to a senior Vatican advisor. The conversation was brief but intense. Edward couldn't hear the words, but he could read their body language: secrecy, tension, and something like fear. After the event ended, Edward quietly recorded a few key details in his personal duty log: names, times, faces, and a few lines of coded shorthand that only he could understand. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was a soldier's habit, documenting anything that felt off. Whatever the reason, that simple act of recording would later become the foundation of his lawsuit. When the delegation returned to London, Edward expected to move on. But 1 week later, he received a confidential message from an American number he didn't recognize. It read, "Delete everything from Rome. This is not your concern." There was no name, no signature, only that message. For the first time in his career, Edward felt fear. Who knew he had kept records? How did they have his private number? He reported it to his superior, but the matter was quietly brushed aside. "It's probably nothing," his captain said. "Stay focused on your duty." But deep down, Edward knew it was something. Over the next few months, subtle threats began to surface. His accounts were hacked. His flat was broken into, yet nothing was stolen. Once, while walking home at night, he noticed a black car following him for several blocks before vanishing into the fog. Still, he remained silent. He wasn't the type to chase drama or attention. He believed in honor, in the quiet dignity of service. But when he discovered years later that his name and service ID had been used in a fake contract connected to an overseas fund, something inside him snapped. The documents tied back to one of the same firms he had seen in Rome, the same one that had met with J.D. Vance. That was when he realized his silence had been used against him. He began piecing everything together, his notes, old duty logs, confidential reports, and hidden communications. It painted a picture of corruption far larger than he had imagined. Money had been moved through diplomatic channels under the pretext of security cooperation, and his signature had been forged to authorize part of it. Edward reached out to legal advisors quietly, unsure whom to trust. "If you go forward with this," one warned him, "you'll be going against some of the most powerful people in two governments." He nodded. "Then I'll need to be louder than them." By the time the news broke years later about his $100 million lawsuit, few knew that it all began with a 3-day assignment in the Vatican. One that should have been routine but instead exposed a shadow network operating behind diplomacy and politics. Edward Marshall, once a nameless protector in uniform, was now the man who dared to challenge the silence of power. And the first whispers of truth were only beginning to echo through the corridors of history. A file hidden for years. After the Vatican mission, Edward Marshall returned to London a changed man. He tried to resume his ordinary duties, ceremonial guard shifts, silent marches, royal events. But something inside him had shifted. The small notebook he carried from Rome stayed locked inside a metal box under his bed. It contained names, times, and brief notes, scribbled quickly during those strange meetings he'd seen. At first, he told himself it was harmless, just a few odd coincidences. But as time went by, small details began to haunt him. A news article here, a leaked report there, each one connecting back to the faces he'd seen in the Vatican corridors. Edward didn't know it yet, but the truth he had written in that notebook would one day become a ticking time bomb. A suspicious offer months after returning home, Edward received a discreet call from a man claiming to represent an international security agency. The caller was polite, almost too polite. "Mr. Marshall," he said, "we're aware you were part of the Vatican assignment. We simply need confirmation of your report for record purposes." Edward froze. He had never written any official report. When he asked for credentials, the line went silent for a few seconds, then the voice replied calmly, "Let's just say we work closely with people you once protected." The call ended, but Edward's instincts screamed danger. He took out his notebook that night and made copies of every page. He scanned the documents, encrypted them using free software he barely understood, and saved them in a folder under a fake name on an old laptop. Then, for extra caution, he placed a printed copy inside a sealed envelope and hid it behind the wallpaper in his flat study room. He didn't trust anyone, not even his colleagues. Years of silence time moved on. Edward retired from the Royal Guard in 2020 after 2 decades of loyal service. He hoped for peace, a quiet life by the countryside, away from ceremony and politics. But peace never came. One night, while scrolling through news on his tablet, he saw a familiar name appear on the screen, J.D. Vance. Now, the senator was speaking at a global conference. shaking hands with the same corporate leaders Edward had seen in Rome, and next to one of them, the man in the grey suit. The same one who had exchanged that envelope years ago. A shiver ran through him. He reached for his old laptop, opened the hidden folder, and stared at the scanned pages of his duty log. The faces, the dates, the coded notes, everything lined up with the new headlines. He realized something terrifying. The events he'd witnessed weren't random. They were part of a larger network, a link between political influence, private security firms, and financial manipulation across borders. For years, Edward told no one. He lived in quiet fear, deleting emails from unknown senders, refusing strange invitations and keeping his blinds closed. But one afternoon, everything changed. The discovery had happened in late 2022 when a local technician came to repair Edward's laptop. While running diagnostics, the man paused and frowned. "Sir," he said, "this system's been accessed remotely, recently." Edward's blood ran cold. Someone had tried to enter the hidden folder. He immediately disconnected the laptop, paid the man, and spent the night printing every file again. Every scan, every note, every log entry. He placed them in a thick folder labeled only with a single word: truth. He then contacted a solicitor, an old friend who had once handled royal contracts. When Edward explained his story, the man leaned back in disbelief. "You're telling me an American senator was involved in covert dealings at a Vatican event, and your name was used for authorization?" Edward nodded. "I have proof," the lawyer exhaled slowly. "Then, my friend, you're holding something dangerous." The leaked file weeks later. While reviewing his old documents, Edward found something he had missed before. A small USB drive taped to the back of one of his notebook pages. He had hidden it himself years ago, but completely forgotten. When he plugged it in, he found encrypted audio files. After hours of decoding, he heard faint voices. One of them unmistakably belonged to J.D. Vance. The conversation was short but clear enough to suggest political promises tied to foreign funding. It was enough to ignite a scandal. He knew if he released it, his life would change forever. But silence had already cost him too much. His reputation, his peace, and his faith and loyalty were gone. So, Edward made a decision, one that would push him into the global spotlight. He wrote a full report, gathered every file, and contacted an international legal team specializing in whistleblower protection. They advised him to stay quiet until the court accepted his case. But word leaked anyway. Someone inside the legal circle talked. Within days, reporters surrounded his small flat. Helicopters hovered above. Old friends refused his calls. He had become the story, the man behind the silence. Despite the chaos, Edward remained calm. The quiet discipline that had once defined him now served as his armor. He spoke little, moved carefully, and always carried a briefcase. Inside it, the only surviving copies of his evidence. Behind closed doors, he often stared at the folder marked Truth. It was worn, creased, but powerful. Proof that even one silent guard could uncover what governments tried to hide. He often thought back to that night in Rome. The handshake, the envelope, the hidden faces. Every detail was still burned in his memory. Now, years later, those same moments had turned into a $100 million lawsuit, one that could bring down a senator, embarrass a government, and change the meaning of loyalty forever. Edward Marshall didn't want fame. He didn't seek revenge. He only wanted justice, and for the world to know that the silence of one honest man could echo louder than the lies of the powerful. But deep down, he knew something darker. If these files ever disappeared again, so would he. Political fallout and denial. When the news of Edward Marshall's lawsuit broke, it hit Washington like an earthquake. Television anchors couldn't stop repeating the number, $100 million, and the name that followed it, Senator J.D. Vance. By sunrise, every major network had turned Edward's story into breaking news. The headlines were dramatic. Royal Guard accuses U.S. Senator of secret dealings. The $100 million allegation that could end a political career. In London, reporters camped outside Edward's flat. In Ohio, crowds gathered outside Vance's offices, shouting questions and holding signs that read, "Truth must speak." The scandal had crossed oceans and now sat at the center of both British honor and American politics. The senator's response, J.D. Vance, appeared calm at first. Standing before a crowd of journalists in a navy suit and forced smile, he called the accusations ridiculous fabrications. He said, "I have never met Mr. Edward Marshall personally, and any claims connecting me to illegal foreign activity are pure lies." His team released a statement minutes later. It was carefully worded, denying everything but leaving small gaps, as political statements often do. It said, Senator Vance had no knowledge of any private meetings or unauthorized transactions during his overseas duties. But those overseas duties, that one phrase, was enough to keep the story alive. The internet pounced on it. Social media users began posting pictures of Vance in Rome during the same week as Edward's alleged assignment. Bloggers zoomed in on background figures, comparing them to Edward's old photos. The resemblance was uncanny. By evening, hashtags like Guard V's Vance and Truth from Rome were trending worldwide. Behind closed doors, inside the senator's office, chaos ruled. Staffers whispered nervously, phones buzzed non-stop, and advisors rushed to manage the damage. Vance slammed his desk once, shouting, "How did this story even get traction? He's a god, for God's sake, and not a diplomat." One aide hesitated before answering. "Sir, it's not just a story anymore. There are documents, time-stamped records that match your itinerary." Vance's jaw tightened. "Then destroy them," he said coldly, but it was too late. Copies of Edward's evidence were already circulating between journalists and legal experts. Some files had been anonymously uploaded to encrypted platforms. The truth was no longer in one man's hands. It had spread like fire. The media storm, every news show dissected the story from every angle. Talk shows brought in body language experts to analyze Edward's calm interviews. Others invited former intelligence officers who said a royal guard wouldn't risk his career unless he had proof. Late-night hosts made jokes, but the laughter couldn't hide the tension. Everyone sensed this was bigger than just a lawsuit. It was a battle between truth and political power, and neither side wanted to back down. Meanwhile, Edward stayed out of sight. He refused interviews, avoided cameras, and only released one short statement through his lawyers. "I stand by my claim. The documents will speak for themselves." Those simple words carried more weight than any press conference could. People began calling him the silent guard. Political pressure builds inside. Washington, Vance's colleagues began to distance themselves. Some avoided him altogether. Behind the scenes, party officials held emergency meetings. One senator whispered to another, "If there's even a fraction of truth in that file, we can't protect him." The White House issued a brief comment. "The matter is under legal review. We will not interfere in the process." But the tone was cold. There was no defense, no support. Even among his donors, fear spread. Several corporate backers quietly pulled funding. One of them told the press anonymously, "We can't risk our reputation being tied to this case." Vance's public image, once strong and proud, began to crack. His approval ratings dropped almost overnight, a whisper of more evidence. Just as the tension started to cool, a new revelation appeared. A foreign journalist released a short article claiming to have an audio recording from the Vatican event, the same one Edward had mentioned. The voices were muffled, but one line stood out. "Keep the transfer quiet. We'll handle the authorization through the guards channel." The article didn't mention names, but everyone connected the dots. Vance's spokesperson immediately denied it, calling it AI-generated nonsense. But experts analyzed the sound clip and confirmed it was authentic and recorded years earlier. That one leak changed everything. Public reaction in Britain. People were divided. Some saw Edward as a hero, the man who dared to challenge corruption. Others said he had betrayed royal confidentiality. But in America, the reaction was far more explosive. Protesters gathered in front of the Senate building, waving banners that read, "No one above truth." Talk radio and podcasts discussed him daily. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some claimed Edward was being used by foreign powers. Others said he was saving democracy. Through it all, Edward stayed quiet. His calm silence, his simple clothes, and his lack of anger made him look even more trustworthy. He wasn't acting like a man chasing money. He was acting like a man protecting something sacred. The turning point a week later, a leaked internal email from Vance's campaign surfaced. In it, a senior advisor wrote, "We need to neutralize the guard before he releases more." The word neutralize sent chills through the public. Edward's legal team filed for emergency protection, citing threats and surveillance attempts. It became clear that this was no longer just a legal dispute. It was a fight for survival. The world watched as two men, one a powerful senator, the other a quiet soldier, stood on opposite sides of truth. Vance still denied everything, but his voice began to tremble during interviews. Cameras caught the nervous tightening of his jaw, the sweat on his collar. He looked less like a confident leader and more like a man cornered by his own secrets. As the scandal deepened, one journalist summed it up best. Power fears silence more than accusation. Because silence can't be debated, it can only be broken. And Edward Marshall, the man who once stood guard for kings, was now standing guard for the truth, alone, but unshaken. The revelation that could end a career. The courtroom was silent. The kind of silence that made even the sound of a paper turning feel loud. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't matter. The world was already watching. Outside, thousands stood behind metal barriers, waiting for a verdict that could destroy one of the most powerful political figures in America. At the center of it all sat Edward Marshall, calm and still, his hands folded neatly on the wooden table. Across from him, Senator J.D. Vance adjusted his tie nervously, his lawyers whispering furiously beside him. After months of headlines, accusations, and political chaos, this was it. The day the truth would finally be revealed, the evidence unsealed. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom. "We will now proceed with the presentation of evidence submitted by the plaintiff." Edward's lawyer stood, holding a thick folder with a red label marked "Confidential, Vatican Files." The crowd leaned forward as she placed the first document on the projector screen. It was a scanned security log, Edward's own handwriting, dated and signed from the Vatican mission. On it were times and names that matched the senator's official travel schedule. "Mr. Marshall," the lawyer began, "can you confirm that this log was written during your assignment in Rome?" "Yes," Edward replied softly. "Every entry was written as part of my duty." "And can you tell the court what this note means? The one that says, unauthorized contact, grey suit, envelope exchange?" Edward took a slow breath. "It means I witnessed a meeting that wasn't part of the official delegation. The man in the grey suit wasn't listed on any Vatican records." J.D. Vance's lawyer immediately stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Speculation." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled. The witness may continue." Edward nodded slightly and continued. "That meeting changed everything. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I knew it wasn't normal. Later, I discovered that same man was connected to a private security firm that received political contracts after that trip." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. The audio recording, then came the part everyone had been waiting for, the audio file. Edward's lawyer inserted a small USB drive into the court system. The sound crackled to life. At first it was quiet. Then, faint voices emerged. One of them clearly belonging to J.D. Vance. "Vance, we'll handle it through the guards channel. No one checks the internal approvals." Unknown voice. "And the funding?" "Vance, the foundation will cover it. Keep the Vatican side clean." Gasps filled the room. J.D. Vance's face went pale. The judge banged his gavel. "Order in the court." But there was no stopping it now. The recording played again, louder this time. The accent, the tone, the calm confidence, unmistakably Vance. His lawyer jumped up. "That recording is doctored. It's AI generated." But Edward's team was ready. They handed over an independent forensic report verifying the audio's authenticity. It had been analyzed by 3 separate labs. The timestamps matched the night of the Vatican meeting. A paper trail of power. Next came the bank records. Wire transfers from offshore accounts linked to Vance's campaign foundation. Amounts in the hundreds of thousands, moving through intermediaries tied to the same private firm Edward had seen years ago. Each page was like a nail in a coffin. Edward didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Vance, he just sat quietly, answering every question with precision, never raising his voice, never losing focus. For the first time, the senator looked smaller. Not the confident politician from TV, but a man cornered by his own lies. His lawyers whispered frantic strategies, but nothing worked. The facts were too clear. The breaking point. After hours of testimony, Vance could no longer stay silent. He stood up suddenly, shouting, "This is political theater! This man is being used to destroy me." The judge slammed his gavel again. "Sit down, Senator, or I will hold you in contempt." The room fell silent again. Edward turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Vance's for the first time. There was no anger there, only quiet disappointment. It was the look of a soldier who had once believed in honor, now seeing it crushed by greed. The reaction. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. News channels aired the audio clip every hour. Commentators called it the most shocking revelation in modern politics. Protesters cheered when they heard Edward's calm voice explaining the truth. Supporters held signs reading, "Justice has a name, Edward Marshall." In Washington, senators held emergency meetings. Within 24 hours, J.D. Vance's committee positions were suspended. Donors cut ties completely. His political party released a statement calling the situation deeply troubling. For the first time in his career, Vance's future looked uncertain. A man without fear when the day's hearing ended. Reporters swarmed Edward as he stepped outside. Microphones surrounded him. Flashes went off non-stop. One journalist shouted, "Mr. Marshall, do you believe this will end Senator Vance's career?" Edward paused for a moment, then said quietly, "I didn't come here to end anyone's career. I came here to tell the truth. Whatever ends, ends because it deserves to." Those words were replayed around the world. That night he returned to his hotel, sitting alone by the window. The lights of the city glowed below him, but he didn't smile. He knew the fight wasn't over. Powerful people would come for him, people who had more to lose than Vance himself. Still, he felt lighter. For years, he had carried a secret that haunted his every breath. Now it was out in the open. The truth was no longer hidden in files or sealed folders. It belonged to the world. The beginning of the end the next morning. Newspapers across both continents carried the same headline: "Audio proof exposes secret deal, J.D. Vance's political career in ruins." But Edward didn't celebrate. He simply packed his small bag, put on his old guard's coat and walked outside into the cool morning air. He looked up at the sky, calm and expressionless. For years he had guarded kings, queens and politicians, but now he guarded something even greater, the truth itself. And for the first time in a long time, Edward Marshall finally felt free. The final blow, the storm had passed, at least on the surface. But for Edward Marshall, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise that came before. It had been 3 weeks since the court released the audio recordings and financial documents that exposed Senator J.D. Vance's secret dealings. The revelations had spread across every major network in the world. Political analysts called it the fall of an empire built on deception. Yet while the world debated, Edward lived quietly in a safe house somewhere on the outskirts of London. No guards, no spotlight, just the faint hum of city lights in the distance and the knowledge that his truth had finally been heard. The collapse of a senator in Washington, J.D. Vance's world was crumbling piece by piece. Within days of the trial, several government committees announced independent investigations. Donors who once stood proudly beside him disappeared. Political allies unfollowed him in public statements. Even his closest aides began to testify against him, trading loyalty for survival. The final blow came when an ethics committee revealed that Vance's foundation, had funneled millions in foreign funds disguised as charity donations, all traced back to the same shell companies connected to that Vatican meeting. In a televised press conference, Vance tried one last time to defend himself. His voice shook as he declared, "I have never betrayed my country. This is a witch hunt." But the evidence was undeniable. The crowd booed. Some threw papers at the podium. Others simply turned their backs and walked away. By the next morning, J.D. Vance had resigned from office. His career, once built on ambition, power, and charm, had collapsed in front of the world. The price of truth back in London. Edward sat by the window, sipping tea as the radio played a breaking news segment about Vance's resignation. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply stared into the grey clouds, lost in thought. He had won the battle, yes, but the victory felt strange. Empty even, because truth, he realized, always comes at a cost. Since the lawsuit, he had received dozens of threats. Letters slipped under his door, untraceable calls, shadowy figures watching from across the street. His lawyers arranged for temporary protection, but Edward refused to hide forever. He told them, "I've stood guard in front of kings. I won't hide from cowards." Still, the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. He had spent most of his life believing in loyalty, silence, and obedience. Now he had broken the very code that defined him. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet peace began to grow. For the first time in years, he could breathe without guilt. A letter from the Vatican one morning. A letter arrived, sealed with a golden emblem. It was from the Vatican itself. Inside, written in graceful handwriting, were just a few lines. "We acknowledge the courage it takes to speak truth, even when truth threatens power. Your service once protected our walls. Now it protects the world." Edward read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in his journal. It was the first time anyone from his old world had recognized his sacrifice. The world reacts. The world didn't move on easily. New investigations opened in Europe. Following the money trail Edward had exposed, several businessmen were arrested. 2 members of a foreign advisory board resigned. Television channels replayed the trial footage for weeks. Documentaries were planned. People began calling Edward a hero, a whistleblower, a modern knight of truth, but he refused all interviews and offers. He didn't want to become a symbol. He wanted to be forgotten, to fade quietly into the ordinary life he had always wanted. He rented a small cottage near the coast, where he spent his days walking along the cliffs and writing in his notebook, not about politics, not about scandals, but about peace, about silence, about the duty of ordinary men to do what's right when no one else will. The unexpected visit one foggy afternoon. There was a knock on his door. A young journalist stood there, nervous but determined. "Mr. Marshall," she said, "I'm writing a book about truth-tellers. I wanted to thank you. Because of your case, my brother decided to expose corruption in his own company. You gave him courage." Edward didn't know what to say. He simply nodded and smiled faintly. When she left, he sat quietly for a long time. For years, he had thought his voice was small, that one man's truth couldn't change much. But now he realized it had started something larger than himself. Truth, he thought, spreads like fire, slow at first, then unstoppable. A quiet ending. Months later, the world had moved on. New elections replaced old faces, new scandals emerged, and the public's attention drifted elsewhere. But in history books and digital archives, one headline remained. Royal Guard's testimony brings down Senator, a story of duty and courage. Edward's name became a quiet legend, not celebrated with parades or medals, but remembered in whispers, in late-night conversations about honesty and power. He never returned to the palace, never sought recognition, and never spoke to the press again. He lived the rest of his life quietly, tending to a small garden behind his cottage and watching the sunset fade into the sea. Sometimes, he would open the old folder marked Truth and run his fingers across the pages. The ink had faded a little, but the meaning hadn't. He would smile to himself and whisper, "It was worth it." Legacy years later. A foundation was created in his name, the Marshall Trust for Ethical Service, supporting whistleblowers and soldiers who chose integrity over silence. And though Edward never saw himself as a hero, his story became a reminder to the world. Power may rule nations, but truth rules history. In the end, the man who once guarded kings had guarded something far greater, the conscience of humanity. And as the waves crashed softly outside his window that evening, Edward Marshall closed his notebook one last time, knowing his duty was finally done.